Okay, so here we go. The Call of the Canyon, requested by Chris Alberti. I think he might have randomly selected it from a bunch of the Zane Grey books. So ostensibly, this is about a World War I veteran finding his way back after the end of the war, the Great War. Um, in the little notes thing I read, it said gassed and shell shocked, trying to return to his life. Some other like little brief little reviews I read of it there said it's more akin to a Harlequin romance, like a Western romance. So I don't know. Maybe this will give Buck Twain a run for his money. Who knows? We're gonna find out. I've not read it before, but there we go. There we go. If anyone is new to the stream here, by the way, hi, I'm Stephen J Carrington, and I do this Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Just read for a couple of hours, work our way through some books, and have a bit of a social chat while we're doing it there. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. If you are in the stream, by all means, please share the stream with your friends. And there's little share buttons below it there. Let them know what you like watching or listening to. Some people tune in just to have like a little listen to what's going on. That's fine. That's fine. I'll just be reading in the background. But in the meantime, we should get on with it. Let's do it. The Call of the Canyon by Zane Grey. Oh, need my keyboard. One second. Got it. There we go. The Call of the Canyon. Well, we still got. There's only 12 chapters. How long is this? Don't know. How long are each chapter? We'll find out. Chapter 1. What subtle, strange message had come to her out of the west? Carly Birch laid the letter in her lap and gazed dreamily through the window. It was a day typical of early April in New York, rather cold and gray, with steely sunlight. Spring breathed in the air, but the women passing along 57th Street wore furs and wraps. She heard the distant clatter of an L train, and then the hum of a motor car. A hurdy-gurdy jarred into the interval of the night. "Glenn has been gone over a year," she mused. 3 months over a year. And of all his strange letters, this seems the strangest yet. She lived again, for the 1000th time, the last moments she had spent with him. It had been on New Year's Eve, 1918. They had called upon friends who were staying at the McAlpin, in a suite on the 21st floor, overlooking Broadway. And when the last quarter of that eventful and tragic year began slowly to pass with the low swell of whistles and bells, Carly's friends had discreetly left her alone with her lover at the open window to watch and hear the old year out, the new year in. Glenn Kilbourne had returned from France early that year, shell-shocked, gassed, and otherwise incapacitated for service in the army, a wreck of his former sterling self, and in many unaccountable ways a stranger to her. Cold, silent, haunted by something, he had made her miserable with his aloofness. But as the bells began to ring out the year that had been his ruin, Glenn had drawn her close, tenderly, passionately, and yet strangely, too. "Carly, look and listen," he had whispered. Under them stretched the great, long, white flare of Broadway, with its snow-covered length glittering under a myriad of electric lights. 6th Avenue swerved away to the right, a less brilliant lane of blanched snow. The L trains crept along like huge, fire-eyed serpents. The hum of the ceaseless moving line of motor cars drifted upward faintly, almost drowned in the rising clamor of the street. Broadway's gay and thoughtless crowds surged to and fro, from that height merely a thick stream of black figures, like contending columns of ants on the march. and everywhere the monstrous electric signs flared up vivid in white and red and green, and dimmed and paled, only to flash up again. Ring out the old, ring in the new. Carly had poignantly felt the sadness of the one, the promise of the other, as one by one the siren factory whistles opened up with deep, hoarse bellow. The clamor of the street and the ringing of the bells were lost in a volume of continuous sound that swelled on high into a magnificent roar. It was the voice of a city, of a nation. It was the voice of a people crying out the strife and the agony of the year, pealing forth a prayer for the future. Glenn had put his lips to her ear. It's like the voice in my soul. Never would she forget the shock of that, and how she had stood, spellbound, enveloped in the mighty volume of sound, no longer discordant, but full of great, pregnant melody, until the white ball burst upon the tower of the Times building, showing the bright figures 1919. Good morning, Lightning. How you doing, man? Good to see you. Glad to have you here. The new year had not been many minutes old when Glenn Kilbourne had told her he was going west to try to recover his health. Carly roused out of her memories to take up the letter that had so perplexed her. It bore the postmark Flagstaff, Arizona. She reread it with slow, pondering thoughtfulness. West Fork, March 25th. Dear Carly, it does seem my neglect in writing you is unpardonable. I used to be a pretty fair correspondent, but in that, as in other things, I have changed. One reason I have not answered sooner is because your letter was so sweet and loving that it made me feel an ungrateful and unappreciative wretch. Another is that this life I now lead does not induce writing. I am outdoors all day, and when I get back to this cabin at night, I'm too tired for anything but bed. Your imperious questions I must answer, and that must, of course, is a third reason why I have delayed my reply. First, you ask, don't you love me any more as you used to? Frankly, I do not. I am sure my old love for you before I went to France was selfish, thoughtless, sentimental, and boyish. I am a man now, and my love for you is different. Let me assure you that it has been about all left to me of what is noble and beautiful. Whatever the changes in me for the worse, my love for you, at least, has grown better, finer, purer. And now for your second question. Are you coming home as soon as you are well again? Carly, I am well. I have delayed telling you this because I knew you would expect me to rush back east with the telling. But the fact is, Carly, I'm not coming. Just yet. I wish it were possible for me to make you understand. For a long time, I seem to have been frozen within. When I came back from France, I couldn't talk. It's almost as bad as that now. Yet all that I was then seems to have changed again. It is only fair to tell you that, as I feel now, I hate the city. I hate people. And particularly, I hate that dancing, drinking, lounging set you chase with. I don't want to come east until I'm over that, Suppose I never get over it. Well, Carly, you can free yourself from me by one word that I could never utter. I could never break our engagement. During the hell I went through in the war, my attachment to you saved me from moral ruin, if it did not from perfect honor and fidelity. This is another thing I despair of making you understand. And in the chaos I've wandered through since the war, my love for you was my only anchor. You never guessed, did you, that I lived on your letters until I got well? And now the fact that I might get along without them is no discredit to their charm or to you. It is also hard to put into words, Carly. To lie down with death and get up with death was nothing. To face one's degradation was nothing. But to come home, an incomprehensibly changed man, and to see my old life as strange as if it were the new life of another planet, to try to slip into the old groove, well, no words of mine can tell you how utterly impossible it was. My old job was not open to me, even if I had been able to work. The government that I fought for left me to starve, or to die of my maladies like a dog for all it cared. I could not live on your money, Carly. My people are poor, as you know, so there was nothing for me to do but to borrow a little money from my friends and to come west. I'm glad I had the courage to come. What this West is, I'll never try to tell you, because, loving the luxury and excitement and glitter of the city as you do, you'd think I was crazy. Getting on here in my condition was as hard as trench life. But now, Carly, something has come to me out of the West. That, too, I am unable to put into words. Maybe I can give you an inkling of it. I'm strong enough to chop wood all day. No man or woman passes my cabin in a month. But I am never lonely. I love these vast red canyon walls towering above me, and the silence is so sweet. Think of the hellish din that filled my ears. Even now, sometimes the brook here changes its babbling murmur to the roar of war. I never understood anything of the meaning of nature until I lived under these looming stone walls and whispering pines. So, Carly, try to understand me, or at least be kind. You know they came very near writing "Gone West" after my name, and considering that this out west signifies for me a very fortunate difference. A tremendous difference. For the present, I'll let well enough alone. Adios. Write soon. Love from Glenn. Carly's second reaction to the letter was a sudden upflashing desire to see her lover, to go out west and find him. Impulses with her were rather rare and inhibited, but this one made her tremble. If Glenn was well again, he must have vastly changed from the moody, stone-faced, and haunty-eyed man who had so worried and distressed her. He had embarrassed her, too, for sometimes in her home, meeting young men there who had not gone into the service. He had seemed to retreat into himself, singularly aloof, as if his world was not theirs. Again, with eager eyes and quivering lips, she read the letter. It contained words that lifted her heart. Her starved love greedily absorbed them. In them she had excuse for any resolve that might bring Glenn closer to her, and she pondered over this longing to go see him. Carly had the means to come and go and live as she liked. She did not remember her father, who had died when she was a child. Her mother had left her in the care of a sister, and before the war they had divided their time between New York and Europe, the Adirondacks and Florida. Carly had gone in for Red Cross and relief work with more of sincerity than most of her set. But she was really not used to making any decision as definite and important as that of going out west alone. She had never been farther west than Jersey City, and her conception of the West was a hazy one of vast plains and rough mountains, squalid towns, cattle herds, and uncouth, ill-clad men. So she carried the letter to her aunt, a rather slight woman with a kindly face and shrewd eyes, and who appeared somewhat given to old-fashioned garments. "Aunt Mary, here's a letter from Glenn," said Carly. "It's more of a stumper than usual. Please read it." "Oh, dear me, you look upset," replied the aunt mildly, and adjusting her spectacles, she took the letter. Carly waited impatiently for the perusal, conscious of inward forces coming more and more to the aid of her impulse to go west. Her aunt paused once to murmur how glad she was that Glenn had gotten well, and then she read on to the close. "Carly, that's a fine letter," she said fervently. "Do you see through it?" "No, I don't," replied Carly. "That's why I asked you to read it." "Do you still love Glenn as you used to before?" "Why, Aunt Mary!" exclaimed Carly in surprise. "Excuse me, Carly, if I'm blunt, but the fact is young women of modern times are very different from my kind when I was a girl. You haven't acted as though you pined for Glenn. You gad around almost the same as ever." "Well, what's a girl to do?" protested Carly. "You are 26 years old, Carly," retorted Aunt Mary. "Well, suppose I am. I'm as young as I ever was." "Well, let's not argue about modern girls and modern times. We never get anywhere," returned her aunt kindly. "But I can tell you something of what Glenn Kilbourne means in that letter, if you want to hear it." "I do, indeed." "Good morning, R.C. Kohler. Good morning. We're just starting." "The war did something horrible to Glenn, aside from wrecking his health. Shell shock, they said. I don't understand that. Out of his mind, they said. But that was never true. Glenn was as sane as I am, and my dear, that's pretty sane, I'll have you remember. But he must have suffered some terrible blight to his spirit, some blunting of his soul. For months after he returned, he walked as one in a trance. Then came a change. He grew restless. Perhaps that change was for the better. At least it showed he had roused. Glenn saw you and your friends and the life you lead, and all the present, with eyes from which the scales had dropped. He saw what was wrong. He never said so to me, but I knew it. It wasn't only to get well that he went west. It was to get away. And, Carly Birch, if your happiness depends on him, you had better be up and doing, or you'll lose him." "Aunt Mary," gasped Carly. "I mean it. That letter shows how near he came to the valley of the shadow, and how he has become a man. If I were you, I'd go out west. Surely there must be a place where it would be all right for you to stay." "Oh, yes," replied Carly eagerly. "Glenn wrote me there was a lodge where people went in nice weather, right down in the canyon, not far from his place. Then, of course, the town, Flagstaff, isn't far. Aunt Mary, I think I'll go." "I would. You're certainly wasting your time here." "But I could only go for a visit," rejoined Carly thoughtfully. "A month, perhaps 6 weeks, if I could stand it." "Seems to me if you could stand New York, you could stand that place," said Aunt Mary dryly. "The idea of staying away from New York any length of time, why, I couldn't do it. But I can stay out there long enough to bring Glenn back with me." "That may take longer than you think," replied her aunt, with a gleam in her shrewd eyes. "If you want my advice, you will surprise Glenn. Don't write him. Don't give him a chance to suggest courteously that you'd better not come just yet. I don't like his words just yet." "Auntie, you're rather more than blunt," said Carly, divided between resentment and amaze. Glenn would simply be wild to have me come." "Maybe he would. Has he ever asked you?" "No. Come to think of it, he hasn't," replied Carly reluctantly. "Aunt Mary, you hurt my feelings." "Well, child, I'm glad to learn your feelings are hurt," returned the aunt. "I'm sure, Carly, that underneath all this blasé ultra-something you've acquired, there's a real heart. Only you must hurry and listen to it, or—" "Or what?" queried Carly. Aunt Mary shook her gray head sagely. Never mind what. Carly, I'd like your idea of the most significant thing in Glenn's letter. Why, his love for me, of course, replied Carly. Naturally you'd think that, but I don't. What struck me most were his words, out of the West. Carly, you'd do well to ponder over them. I will, rejoined Carly positively. I'll do more. I'll go out to his wonderful West and see what he meant by them. Carly Birch possessed in full degree the prevailing modern craze for speed. She loved a motor-car ride at 60 miles an hour along a smooth, straight road, or better, on the level seashore of Ormond, where the moonlight nights... Or better, on the level sea of Ormond, where on moonlight nights the white blanched sand seems to flash toward her. Therefore, quite to her taste was the 20th Century Limited, which was hurtling her on the way to Chicago. The unceasingly smooth and even rush of the train satisfied something in her. An old lady sitting in an adjoining seat with a companion amused Carly by the remark, "I wish people didn't go so fast. People nowadays haven't time to draw a comfortable breath. Suppose we should run off the track." Carly had no fear of express trains or motor cars or transatlantic liners. In fact, she prided herself in not being afraid of anything. But she wondered if this was not the false courage of association with a crowd. Before this enterprise at hand, she could not remember anything she had undertaken alone. Her thrills seemed to be in abeyance to the end of her journey. That night her sleep was permeated with the steady, low whirring of the wheels. Once, roused by a jerk, she lay awake in the darkness, while the thought came to her that she and all her fellow passengers were really at the mercy of the engineer. Who was he, and did he stand at his throttle, keen and vigilant, thinking of the lives entrusted to him? Such thoughts vaguely annoyed Carly, and she dismissed them. A long half-day wait in Chicago was a tedious preliminary to the second part of her journey. But at last she found herself aboard the California Limited, and went to bed with a relief quite a stranger to her. The glare of the sun under the curtain awakened her. Propped up on her pillows, she looked out at apparently endless green fields or pastures, dotted now and then with little farmhouses and tree-skirted villages. This country, she thought, must be the prairie land she remembered laying west of the Mississippi. Later, in the dining car, the steward smilingly answered her question. "Oh, this is Kansas, and those green fields out there are the wheat that feeds the nation." Carly was not impressed. The color of the short wheat appeared soft and rich, and the boundless fields stretched away monotonously. She had not known there was so much flat land in the world, and she imagined it might be a fine country for automobile roads. When she got back to her seat, she drew the blinds down and read her magazines. Then, tiring of that, she went back to the observation car. Carly was accustomed to attracting attention, and did not resent it, unless she was annoyed. The train evidently had a full complement of passengers, who, as far as Carly could see, were people not of her station in life. The glare from the many windows, and the rather crass interest of several men, drove her back to her own section. There she discovered that someone had drawn up her window shades. Carly promptly pulled them down and settled herself comfortably. Then she heard a woman speak, not particularly low. "I thought people traveled west to see the country." And a man replied, rather dryly, "Well, not always." His companion went on, "If that girl was mine, I'd let down her skirt." The man laughed and replied, "Martha, you're sure behind the times. Look at the pictures in the magazines." Such remarks amused Carly, and later she took advantage of an opportunity to notice her neighbors. They appeared a rather quaint old couple, reminding her of the natives of country towns in the Adirondacks. She was not amused, however, when another of her woman neighbors, speaking low, referred to her as a lunger. Carly appreciated the fact that she was pale, but she assured herself there ended any possible resemblance that she might have to a consumptive. And she was somewhat pleased to hear this woman's male companion forcibly voice her own convictions. In fact, he was nothing if not admiring. Kansas was interminably long to Carly, and she went to sleep before riding out of it. Next morning she found herself looking out at the rough, gray, and black land of New Mexico. She searched for the horizon for mountains, but there did not appear to be any. She received a vague, slow-dawning impression that was hard to define. She did not like the country, though that was not the impression which eluded her. Bare, gray flats, low scrub-fringed hills, bleak cliffs, jumble after jumble of rocks, and occasionally a long vista down a valley, somehow compelling. These passed before her gaze until she tired of them. Where was the West Glenn had written about? One thing seemed sure, and that it was every mile of this crude country brought her nearer to him. This recurring thought gave Carly all the pleasure she had felt so far in this endless ride. It struck her that England or France could be dropped down into New Mexico, and scarcely be noticed. By and by the sun grew hot. The train wound slowly and creakingly upgrade. The car became full of dust, all of which was disagreeable to Carly. She dozed on her pillow for hours until she was stirred by a passenger crying out delightedly, "Look, Indians!" Carly looked, not without interest. As a child she had read about Indians, and memory returned images both colorful and romantic. From the car window she espied dusty flat barrens, low squat mud houses, and queer-looking little people. Children naked or extremely ragged and dirty, women in loose garments with flares of red, and men in white man's garb, slovenly and motley. All these strange individuals stared apathetically as the train slowly passed. "Good morning, Gianna. Good morning. They did it again, Project Red delayed cyber." Yes, I just read that. It is, boy oh boy. And then they're taking their time getting that game done. It's had its fair share of issues. "Indians," muttered Carly incredulously. "Well, if they are the noble red people, my illusions are dispelled." She did not look out of the window again, not even when the brakeman called out the remarkable name of Albuquerque. Next day, Carly's languid attention quickened to the name of Arizona, and to the frowning red walls of rock, and to the vast rolling stretches of cedar-dotted land. Nevertheless, it affronted her. This was no country for people to live in, and so far as she could see, it was indeed uninhabited. Her sensations were not, however, limited to sight. She became aware of unfamiliar, disturbing little shocks or vibrations in her eardrums, and after that a disagreeable bleeding of the nose. The porter told her this was owing to the altitude. Thus, one thing and another kept Carly most of the time away from the window, so that she really saw very little of the country. From what she had seen, she drew the conviction that she had not missed much. At sunset, she deliberately gazed out to discover what an Arizona sunset was like, just a pale yellow flare. She had seen better than that above the Palisades. Not until reaching Winslow did she realize how near she was to her journey's end, and that she would arrive at Flagstaff after dark. She grew conscious of nervousness. Suppose Flagstaff were like those other queer little towns. Good morning, Anya. Good to see you. Good to see you. Oh, let's take an, oh, my mouse froze. Good Lord. Yeah, all right, we're starting to get a few people in here. Yeah, nice. Good morning. We're still in Chapter 1. Chapter 1 here, Anya. And Gianna. Her fiance, Glenn, has returned from the war, and they met up in New York City, and then he abandoned, pretty much left her, basically. Headed over to the American West to rediscover himself, and she has just left New York City. She's a big city girl to go visit him. That's where we're at. Not only once, but several times before the train slowed down for her destination, did Carly wish she had sent Glenn word to meet her. And when, presently, she found herself standing out in the dark, cold, windy night before a dim-lit railroad station, she more than regretted her decision to surprise Glenn. But that was too late, and she must make the best of her poor judgment. Men were passing to and fro on the platform, some of whom appeared to be very dark of skin and eye, and were probably Mexicans. At length an expressman approached Carly, soliciting patronage. He took her bags, and depositing them in a wagon, he pointed up the wide street. One block up and turn, Hotel Weatherford. Then he drove off. Carly followed, carrying her small satchel. A cold wind, driving the dust, stung her face as she crossed the street to a high sidewalk that extended along the block. There were lights in the stores and on the corners, yet she seemed impressed by a dark, cold, windy bigness. Many people, mostly men, were passing up and down, and there were motor cars everywhere. No one paid any attention to her. Gaining the corner of the block, she turned and was relieved to see the hotel sign. As she entered the lobby, a clicking of pool balls and the discordant rasp of a phonograph assailed her ears. The expressman set down her bags and left Carly standing there. The clerk, or proprietor, was talking from behind his desk to several men, and there were lounges in the lobby. The air was thick with tobacco smoke. No one paid any attention to Carly until at length she stepped up to the desk and interrupted the conversation there. "Is this a hotel?" she queried brusquely. The shirt-sleeved individual leisurely turned and replied, "Yes, ma'am." And Carly said, "No one would recognize it by the courtesy shown. I've been standing here waiting to register." With the same leisurely case and a cool, laconic stare, the clerk turned the book toward her. "Reckon people round here ask for what they want." Carly made no further comment. She assuredly recognized that what she had been accustomed to could not be expected out here. What she most wished to do at the moment was to get close to the big open grate where a cheery red and gold fire cracked. It was necessary, however, to follow the clerk. He assigned her to a small, drab room, which contained a bed, a bureau, and a stationary washstand with one spigot. There was also a chair. While Carly removed her coat and hat, the clerk went downstairs for the rest of her luggage. Upon his return, Carly learned that a stage left the hotel for Oak Creek Canyon at 9 o'clock next morning. And this cheered her so much that she faced the strange sense of loneliness and discomfort with something of fortitude. There was no heat in the room and no hot water. When Carly squeezed the spigot handle, there burst forth a torrent of water that spouted up out of the wash basin to deluge her. It was colder than any ice water she had ever felt. It was piercingly cold. Hard upon the surprise and shock, Carly suffered a flash of temper. But then the humor of it struck her, and she had to laugh. "Serves you right, you spoiled doll of luxury," she mocked. "This is out west. Shiver and wait on yourself." Never before had she undressed so swiftly, nor felt grateful for thick woolen blankets on a hard bed. Gradually she grew warm. The blackness, too, seemed rather comforting. "I'm only 20 miles from Glenn," she whispered. "How strange. I wonder, will he be glad?" She felt a sweet, glowing assurance of that. Sleep did not come readily. Excitement had laid hold of her nerves, and for a long time she lay awake. After a while, the chug of motor cars, the click of pool balls, the murmur of low voices, all ceased. Then she heard a sound of wind outside, an intermittent, low moaning, new to her ears, and somehow pleasant. Another sound greeted her, the musical clanging of a clock that struck the quarters of the hour. Some time, late, sleep claimed her. Upon awakening, she found she had overslept, necessitating haste upon her part. As to that, the temperature of the room did not admit of leisurely dressing. She had no adequate name for the feeling of the water, and her fingers grew so numb that she made what she considered a disgraceful matter of her attire. Downstairs in the lobby, another cheerful red fire burned in the grate. How perfectly satisfying was an open fireplace! She thrust her numb hands almost into the blaze, and simply shook with the tingling pain that slowly warmed out of them. The lobby was deserted. A sign directed her to a dining room in the basement, where, of the ham and eggs and strong coffee, she managed to partake a little. Then she went upstairs into the lobby and out into the street. A cold, piercing air seemed to blow right through her. Walking to the near corner, she paused to look around. Down the main street flowed a leisurely stream of pedestrians, horses, cars, extending between 2 blocks of low buildings. Across from where she stood lay a vacant lot, beyond which began a line of neat, oddly constructed houses, evidently residents of the town. And then, lifting her gaze, instinctively drawn by something obstructing the skyline, she was suddenly struck with surprise and delight. "Oh, how perfectly splendid!" she burst out. 2 magnificent mountains loomed right over her, sloping up with majestic sweep of green and black timber to a ragged, tree-fringed snow area that swept up cleaner and whiter, at last to lift pure, glistening peaks, noble and sharp, and sunrise-flushed, against the blue. Carly had climbed Mont Blanc, and she had seen the Matterhorn, but they had never struck such amaze and admiration from her as these twin peaks of her native land. "What mountains are those?" she asked a passer-by. "San Francisco peaks, ma'am," replied the man. "Why, they can't be over a mile away," she said. 18 miles, ma'am," he returned with a grin. "Sure this Arizona air is deceiving." "How strange," muttered Carly. "It's not that way in the Adirondacks." She was still gazing upward when a man approached and said the stage for Oak Creek Canyon would soon be ready to start, and he wanted to know if her baggage was ready. Carly hurried back to her room to pack. She had expected the stage would be a motor bus, or at least a large touring car, but it turned out to be a 2-seated vehicle drawn by a team of ragged horses. The driver was a little wizen-faced man of doubtful years, and he did not appear obviously susceptible to the importance of his passenger. There was considerable freight to be hauled, besides Carly's luggage, but evidently she was the only passenger. "Reckon it's going to be a bad day," said the driver. "These April days high up in the desert are windy and cold. Maybe it'll snow, too. Them clouds hanging around the peaks ain't very promising. Now, miss, haven't you a heavier coat or something?"
No, I haven't," replied Carly. "I'll have to stand it. Did you say this was desert?"
"I sure did. Well, there's a hoss blanket under the seat, and you can have that," he replied, and climbing to the seat in front of Carly, he took up the reins and started the horses off at a trot. At the first turning, Carly became specifically acquainted with the driver's meaning of a bad day. A gust of wind, raw and penetrating, laden with dust and stinging sand, swept full in her face. It came so suddenly that she was scarcely quick enough to close her eyes. It took considerable clumsy effort on her part, with a handkerchief, aided by relieving tears, to clear her sight again. Thus, uncomfortably, Carly found herself launched on the last lap of her journey. All before her and alongside lay the squalid environs of the town. Looked back at, with the peaks rising behind, it was not unpicturesque. But the hard road, with its sheets of flying dust, the bleak But the hard road, with its sheets of flying dust, the bleak railroad yards, the round pens she took for cattle corrals, and the sordid debris littering the approach to a huge sawmill, these were offensive in Carly's sight. From a tall, dome-like stack rose a yellowish smoke that spread overhead, adding to the lowering aspect of the sky. Beyond the sawmill extended the open country, sloping somewhat roughly, and evidently once a forest, but now a hideous bare slash, with ghastly burned stems of trees still standing, and myriads of stumps attesting to denudation. The bleak road wound away to the southwest, and from this direction came the gusty wind. It did not blow regularly, so that Carly could be on her guard. It lulled now and then, and permitting her to look about, and then suddenly again whipping dust into her face. The smell of the dust was as unpleasant as the sting. It made her nostrils smart. It was penetrating, and a little more of it would have been suffocating. And as a leaden gray bank of broken clouds rolled up, the wind grew stronger and the air colder. Chilled before, Carly now became thoroughly cold. There appeared to be no end to the devastated forest land, and the farther she rode, the more barren and sordid grew the landscape. Carly forgot about the impressive mountains behind her. And as the ride wore into hours, such was her discomfort and disillusion that she forgot about Glenn Kilbourne. She did not reach the point of regretting her adventure, but she grew mightily unhappy. Now and then she espied dilapidated log cabins and surroundings even more squalid than the ruined forest. What wretched abodes! Could it be possible that people had lived in them? She imagined men had, but hardly women and children. Somewhere she had forgotten an idea that women and children were extremely scarce in the West. Straggling bits of forest, yellow pines, the driver called the trees, began to encroach upon the burned-over and arid barren land. To Carly, these groves, by reason of contrast and proof of once To Carly, these groves, by reason of contrast and proof of what once was, only rendered the landscape more forlorn and dreary. Why had these miles and miles of forest been cut? By money grubbers, she supposed, the same as were devastating the Adirondacks. Presently, when the driver had to halt to repair or adjust something wrong with the harness, Carly was grateful for a respite from cold inaction. She got out and walked. Sleet began to fall, and when she resumed her seat in the vehicle, she asked the driver for the blanket to cover her. The smell of this horse blanket was less endurable than the cold. Carly huddled down into a state of apathetic misery. Already she had enough of the West. But the sleet storm passed, the clouds broke, the sun shone through, greatly mitigating her discomfort. By and by, the road led into a section of real forest, unspoiled in any degree. Carly saw large grey squirrels with tufted ears and white bushy tails. Presently the driver pointed out a flock of huge birds, which Carly, on second glance, recognized as turkeys, only these were sleek and glossy, with flecks of bronze and black and white, quite different from turkeys back east. "There must be a farm near," said Carly, gazing about. "No, ma'am, them's wild turkeys," replied the driver, "and sure the best eatin' you ever had in your life." A little while afterwards, as they were emerging from the woodland into more denuded country, he pointed out to Carly a herd of grey, white-rumped animals that she took to be sheep. "And them's antelope," he said. "Once this desert was overrun by antelope, then they nearly disappeared, and now they're increasing again." More barren country, more bad weather, and especially an exceedingly rough road, reduced Carly to her former state of dejection. The jolting over roots and rocks and ruts was worse than uncomfortable. She had to hold on to the seat to keep from being thrown out. The horses did not appreciably change their gait for rough sections of the road. Then a more severe jolt brought Carly's knee in violent contact with an iron bolt on the forward seat, and it hurt her so acutely that she had to bite her lips to keep from screaming. The smoother stretch of road did not come any too soon for her. It led into the forest again, and Carly soon became aware that they had at last left the cut and burned-over district of timberland behind. A cold wind moaned through the tree-tops and set the drops of water pattering down upon her. It lashed her wet face. Carly closed her eyes and sagged in her seat, mostly oblivious to the passing scenery. "The girls will never believe this of me," she soliloquized. And indeed she was amazed at herself. Then thought of Glenn strengthened her. It did not really matter what she suffered on the way to him, only she was disgusted at her lack of stamina and her appalling sensitiveness to discomfort. "Well, here's Oak Creek Canyon," called the driver. Carly, rousing out of her weary preoccupation, opened her eyes to see that the driver had halted at a turn of the road, where apparently it descended a fearful declivity. The very forest-fringed earth seemed to have opened into a deep abyss, ribbed by red rock walls and choked by steep mats of green timber. The chasm was a V-shaped split, and so deep that looking downward sent at once a chill and a shudder over Carly. At that point it appeared narrow and ended in a box. In another direction it widened and deepened, and stretched farther on between tremendous walls of red, and split its winding floor of green with glimpses of a gleaming creek, boulder-strewn and ridged by white rapids. A low, mellow roar of rushing water floated up to Carly's ears. What a wild, lonely, terrible place! Could Glenn possibly live down there in that ragged rent in the earth? It frightened her, the sheer sudden plunge of it from the heights. Far down the gorge a purple light shone on the forested floor, and on the moment the sun burst through the clouds and sent a golden blaze down into the depths, transforming them incalculably. The great cliffs turned gold, the creek changed to glancing silver, the green of trees vividly freshened, and in the clefts rays of sunlight burned into the blue shadows. Carly had never gazed upon a scene like this. Hostile and prejudiced, she yet felt wrung from her an acknowledgment of beauty and grandeur. But wild, violent, savage, not livable. This insulated rift in the crust of the earth was a gigantic burrow for beasts, perhaps for outlawed men, not for a civilized person,
Not for Glenn Kilbourne. "Don't be scart, ma'am," spoke up the driver. "It's safe if you're careful, and I've druv this many the time." Carly's heartbeats thumped at her side, rather denying her taunted assurance of fearlessness. Then the rickety vehicle started down at an angle that forced her to cling to her seat. Okay, well, that's the end of chapter 1. Rose is like, run back east. No man is worth the West. You live in the West, though, don't you, Rose? Oh, Rose is throwing Buck Dwayne under the carriage. Man, I never thought I'd see the day where Rose would say no thank you to Mr. Buck Dwayne. Man. Okay, well, so far so good. I mean, let's see. We're about 9%. So we'll probably we'll probably be done with this. I'd say, and it would probably take us 5 days to get through, maybe something like that. Yeah, okay. You're in the middle of Texas, and that's somewhat better, or is that just as bad? Oh, you hate West Texas, right? I know there's many different sides to Texas there. It's green there. Yeah, okay. You're all about the desert, huh? All right. Well, fair enough. Alrighty. Very, very good. Okay, Scorpion Knights is still with us. Very cool. I hope everyone's up to speed there. Everyone's up to speed with the story. We'll get back to it in just a second. I just wanted to remind people that if you're enjoying the stream there, please throw down one of those thumbs up things there. Help the algorithms out, and and if you're watching this live, please use that share button below. Yeah, if you have not already. Okay, Rose has got to take care of the dishes. Listening in, though, Glenn had better be worth it, she said. I don't know. This might be one of those books which has true love in it. Maybe true love. We'll see. Anya's still with the program. Very good. All right. Thank you, Rose. All right. Okay. She's gonna be AFK. Okay. There we go. A little bit of water, and let's hop right back into it. Let's see. Chapter 2. Oh, thank you, Melissa. Shared on Facebook and liked it on YouTube. Yeah. Let's see. In Chapter 2. Carly, clutching her support, with a bated breath and prickling skin, gazed in fascinated suspense over the rim of the gorge. Sometimes the wheels on that side of the vehicle passed within a few inches of the edge. The brakes squeaked, the wheels slid, and she could hear the scrape of the iron-shod hoofs of the horses as they held back, stiff-legged, obedient to the wary call of the driver. The first 100 yards of that steep road cut out of the cliff appeared to be the worst. It began to widen, with descents less precipitous. Tips of trees rose level with her gaze, obstructing sight of the blue depths. Then brush appeared on each side of the road. Gradually, Carly's strain relaxed, and also the muscular contraction by which she had braced herself in the seat. The horses began to trot again, the wheels rattled, the road wound around abrupt corners, and soon the green and red wall of the opposite side of the canyon loomed close. Low roar of running water rose to Carly's ears. When at length she looked out instead of down, she could see nothing but a mass of green foliage, crossed by tree trunks and branches of brown and gray. Then the vehicle bowled under dark, cool shade, into a tunnel with mossy, wet cliff on one side and close-standing trees on the other. "Reckon we're all right now, unless we meet somebody coming up," declared the driver. Carly relaxed. She drew a deep breath of relief. She had had her first faint intimation that perhaps her extensive experience of motor cars, express trains, transatlantic liners, and even a little of airplanes did not range over the whole of adventurous life. She was likely to meet something entirely new and striking out here in the West. The murmur of falling water sounded closer. Presently, Carly saw that the road turned at the notch in the canyon and crossed a clear, swift stream. Here were huge mossy boulders and red walls covered by lichens, and the air appeared dim and moist and full of mellow, hollow roar. Beyond this crossing, the road descended the west side of the canyon, drawing away and higher from the creek. Huge trees, the like of which Carly had never seen, began to stand majestically up out of the gorge, dwarfing the maples and white-spotted sycamores. The driver called these great trees yellow pines. At last the road led down from the steep slope to the floor of the canyon. What from far above had appeared only a green timber-choked cleft proved from close relation to be a wide, winding valley, tip and down, densely forested for the most part, yet having open glades and bisected from wall to wall by the creek. Every quarter of a mile or so the road crossed the stream, and at these fords Carly again held on desperately and gazed out dubiously, for the creek was deep, swift, and full of boulders. Neither driver nor horses appeared to mind obstacles. Carly was splashed and jolted, not inconsiderably. They passed through groves of oak trees, from which the creek manifestly derived its name, and under gleaming walls, cold, wet, gloomy, and silent, and between lines of solemn, wide-spreading pines. Carly saw deep, still green pools eddying under huge massed jumbles of cliffs, and stretches of white water, and then, high above the tree-tops, a wild line of canyon rim cold against the sky. She felt shut in from the world, lost in an unscalable rut of the earth. Again the sunlight had failed, and the gray gloom of the canyon oppressed her. It struck Carly as singularly that she could not help being affected by mere weather, mere heights and depths, mere rock walls and pine trees, and rushing water. For really, what had these to do with her? These were only physical things that she was passing. Nevertheless, although she resisted sensation, she was more and more shot through and through with the wildness and savageness of this canyon. A sharp turn of the road to the right disclosed a slope down the creek, across which showed orchards and fields, and a cottage nestling at the base of the wall. The ford at this crossing gave Carly more concern than any that had been passed, for there was greater volume and depth of water. One of the horses slipped on the rocks, plunged up and on with great splash. They crossed, however, without more mishap to Carly than further acquaintance with this iciest of waters. From this point the driver turned back along the creek, passed between orchards and fields, and drove along the base of the red wall to come suddenly upon a large rustic house that had been hidden from Carly's sight. It sat almost against the stone cliff from which poured a white, foamy sheet of water. The house was built of slabs with the bark on, and it had a lower and upper porch running all around, at least as far as the cliff. Green growths from the rock wall overhung the upper porch. A column of blue smoke curled lazily upward from the stone chimney. On one of the porch posts hung a sign with rude lettering, "Lolamai Lodge." "Hey, Josh, did you fetch the flour?" called a woman's voice from inside. "Hello, I reckon I didn't forget nothing," replied the man as he got down. "And say, Miss Hutter, here's a young lady from New York." That latter speech of the driver's... Oh, that was... it was the driver, okay. Boy, okay, I thought that was another man from inside the house. No. "Hello, I reckon I didn't forget nothing," replied the man as he got down. "And say, Miss Hutter, here's a young lady from New York." That latter speech of the driver's brought Mrs. Hutter out onto the porch. "Flo, come here," she called to someone evidently near at hand. And then she smilingly greeted Carly. "Get down and come on in, miss. I'm sure glad to see you." Carly, being stiff and cold, did not very gracefully disengage herself from the high, muddy wheel and step. When she mounted to the porch, she saw that Mrs. Hutter was a woman of middle age, rather stout, with strong face full of fine wavy lines, and kind dark eyes. "I'm Miss Birch," said Carly. "You're the girl whose picture Glenn Kilbourne has over his fireplace," declared the woman heartily. "I'm sure glad to meet you, and my daughter Flo will be too." That about her picture pleased and warmed Carly. "Yes, I'm Glenn Kilbourne's fiancée. I've come west to surprise him. Is he here? Is he... well?" "Oh, fine. I saw him yesterday. He's changed a great deal from what he was at first. Most all the last few months. I reckon you won't know him, but you're wet and cold and you look fagged. Come right into the fire." "Oh, well, thank you. I'm all right," returned Carly. At the doorway they encountered a girl of lithe and robust figure, quick in her movements. Carly was swift to see the youth and grace of her, and then a face that struck Carly as neither pretty nor beautiful, but still wonderfully attractive. "Flo, here's Miss Birch," burst out Mrs. Hutter, with cheerful importance. "Glenn Kilbourne's girl, come all the way from New York to surprise him." "Oh, Carly, I'm sure happy to meet you." Oh, it's been a drawling thing. Well, I'll have to work on a little drawling thing. "Oh, Carly, I'm sure happy to meet you," said the girl in a slow, drawling richness. "I know you. Glenn's told me all about you." I don't know, it needs a little work. Okay. If this greeting, sweet and warm as it seemed, was a shock to Carly, she gave no sign. But as she murmured something in reply, she looked with all a woman's keenness into the face before her. Flo Hutter had a fair skin, generously freckled, a mouth and chin too firmly cut to suggest a softer feminine beauty, and eyes of clear light hazel, penetrating, frank, fearless. Her hair was very abundant, almost silver-gold in color, and it was either rebellious or showed lack of care. Carly liked the girl's looks and liked the sincerity of her greeting, but instinctively she reacted antagonistically because of the frank suggestion of intimacy with Glenn. But for that she would have been spontaneous and friendly rather than restrained. They ushered Carly into a big living room and up to a fire of blazing logs, where they helped divest her of the wet wraps. And all the time they talked in the solicitous way natural to women who were kind and unused to many visitors. Then Mrs. Hutter bustled off to make a cup of hot coffee while Flo talked. "We'll sure give you the nicest room, with a sleeping porch right under the cliff where the water falls. It'll sing you to sleep. Of course, you needn't use the bed outdoors until it's warmer. Spring is late here, you know, and we'll have nasty weather yet. You really happened on Oak Creek at its least attractive season, but then it's always, well, just Oak Creek. You'll come to know." "I dare say I'll remember my first sight of it and the ride down that cliff road," said Carly with a wan smile. "Oh, that's nothing to what you'll see and do," returned Flo knowingly. "We've had eastern tenderfeet here before, and never was there a one of them who didn't come to love Arizona. Tenderfoot. It hadn't occurred to me, but of course, murmured Carly. Then Mrs. Hutter returned, carrying a tray, which she set upon a chair, and drew to Carly's side. "Eat and drink," she said, as if these actions were the cardinally important ones of life. "Flo, you carry your bags up to that west room we always give to some particular person we want to love Lalomi." Next she threw sticks of wood upon the fire, making it crackle and blaze, then seated herself near Carly and beamed upon her. "You'll not mind if we call you Carly?" she asked eagerly. "Oh, indeed no. I'd like it," returned Carly, made to feel friendly and at home in spite of herself. "You see, it's not as if you were just a stranger," went on Mrs. Hutter. "Tom, that's Flo's father, took a liking to Glenn Kilbourne when he first came to Oak Creek over a year ago. I wonder if you know all how sick that soldier boy was. Well, he lay on his back for 2 solid weeks, in the room we're giving you, and I, for one, didn't think he'd ever get up. But he did, and he got better, and after a while he went to work for Tom. Then 6 months and more he invested in the sheep business with Tom. He lived with us until he built his cabin up West Fork. He and Flo have run together a good deal, and naturally he told her about you. So see, you're not a stranger, and we want you to feel you're with friends." "I thank you, Mrs. Hutter," replied Carly feelingly. "I never could thank you enough for being good to Glenn. I did not know he was so sick. At first he wrote, but seldom." "Reckon he never wrote you or told you what he did in the war," declared Mrs. Hutter. "Indeed, he never did." "Well, I'll tell you some day, for Tom found out all about him. Got some of it from a soldier who came to Flagstaff for lung trouble. He'd been in the same company with Glenn. Oh, he didn't know this boy's name while he was in Flagstaff, but later Tom found out. John Henderson. He was only 22, a fine lad, and he died in Phoenix. We tried to get him out here, but the boy wouldn't live on charity. He was always expecting money, a war bonus, whatever that was. It didn't come. He was a clerk at the El Tavar for a while. Then he came to Flagstaff, but it was too cold, and he stayed there too long." "Oh, too bad," rejoined Carly thoughtfully. This information as to the suffering of American soldiers had augmented during the last few months, and seemed to possess strange, poignant power to depress Carly. Always she had turned away from the unpleasant, and the misery of unfortunates was as disturbing almost as direct contact with disease and squalor. But it had begun to dawn upon Carly that there might be circumstances of life, in every way affronting her comfort and happiness, which it would be impossible to turn her back upon. At this juncture Flo returned to the room, and again Carly was struck with the girl's singular freedom of movement, and the sense of sure poise and joy that seemed to emanate from her presence. "Hey, what's up?" Level 5, customarily cheerful and supportive as usual. Good morning, Level 5. And Thayu. Thayu, what's up? It looks like Rose knows all about them tenderfeet, too. "I've made a fire in your little stove," she said. "There's water heating. Now won't you come up and change those traveling clothes? You'll want to fix up for Glenn, won't you?" Carly had to smile at that. This girl indeed was frank and unsophisticated, and somehow refreshing. Carly rose. "You are both very good to receive me as a friend," she said. "I hope I shall not disappoint you. Yes, I do want to improve my appearance before Glenn sees me. Is there any way I can send word to him, by someone who has not seen me?" "There sure is. I'll send Charlie, one of our hired boys." "Oh, thank you. Then tell him to say there is a lady here from New York to see him, and it's very important."
Flo Hutter clapped her hands and laughed with glee. Her gladness gave Carly a little twinge of conscience. Jealousy was an unjust and stifling thing. Carly was conducted up a broad stairway and along a boarded hallway to a room that opened out onto the porch. A steady, low murmur of falling water assailed her ears. Through the open door she saw across the porch to a white, tumbling, lacy veil of water, falling, leaping, changing, so close that it seemed to touch the heavy pole railing of the porch. This room resembled a tent. The sides were of canvas. It had no ceiling, but the rough-hewn shingles of the roof of the house sloped down closely. The furniture was homemade. An Indian rug covered the floor. The bed, with its woolly, clean blankets and the white pillows, looked inviting.
"Is this where Glenn lay, when he was sick?"
queried Carly.
"Yes," replied Flo, gravely, and a shadow darkened her eyes. "I ought to tell you about it. I will some day, but you must not be made unhappy now. Glenn nearly died here. Mother or I never left his side, for a while there, when life was so bad."
She showed Carly how to open the little stove and put the short billets of wood inside and work the damper, and cautioning her to keep an eye on it so it would not get too hot, she left Carly to herself. Rainbow Siege 6 event today. Is that the one with all the Halloween candy? I saw something about that on Twitter. Carly found herself in an unfamiliar mood. There came a leap of her heart every time she thought of the meeting with Glenn, so soon now to be, but it was not that which was unfamiliar. She seemed to have a difficult approach to undefined and unusual thoughts. All this was so different from her regular life. Besides, she was tired. But these explanations did not suffice. There was a pang in her breast which must owe its origin to the fact that Glenn Kilbourne had been ill in this little room, and some other girl than Carly Birch had nursed him.
"Am I jealous?" she whispered. "No."
But she knew in her heart that she lied. A woman could no more help being jealous under such circumstances than she could help the beat and throb of her blood. Nevertheless, Carly was glad Flo had been there, and always she would be grateful to her for that kindness. Carly disrobed, and donning her dressing gown, she unpacked her bags and hung her things upon pegs under the curtained shelves. Then she lay down to rest, with no intention of slumber. But there was a strange magic in the fragrance of the room, like the piney tang outdoors, and in the feel of the bed, and especially in the low, dreamy hum and murmur of the waterfall. She fell asleep. When she awakened, it was 5 o'clock. The fire in the stove was out, but the water was still warm. She bathed and dressed, not without care, yet as swiftly as was her habit at home, and she wore white, because Glenn had always liked her best in white. But it was assuredly not a gown to wear in a country house where draughts of cold air filled the unheated rooms and halls. So she threw round her a warm sweater shawl with colorful bars before coming to her dark eyes and hair. Oh, no. Read that one again. So she threw round her a warm sweater shawl with colorful bars becoming to her dark eyes and hair. All the time that she was dressed and thought, her very being seemed to be permeated by that soft murmuring sound of falling water. No moment of waking life there at Lolamai Lodge, or perhaps of slumber hours, could be wholly free of that sound. It vaguely tormented Carly, yet was not uncomfortable. She went out upon the porch.
The small alcove space held a bed and a rustic chair. Above her, the peeled poles of the roof descended to within a few feet of her head. She had to lean over the rail of the porch to look up. The green and red rock wall sheered ponderously near. The waterfall showed first at the notch of a fissure where the cliff split, and down over smooth places the water gleamed to narrow in a crack with little drops, and suddenly to leap into a thin white sheet. Out from the porch the view was restricted to glimpses between the pines and beyond to the opposite wall of the canyon. How shut in, how walled in, this home!
"In summer it might be good to spend a couple of weeks here," soliloquized Carly. "But to live here, heavens, a person might as well be buried."
Heavy footsteps upon the porch below, accompanied by a man's voice, quickened Carly's pulse. Did they belong to Glenn? After a strained second, she decided not. Nevertheless, the acceleration of her blood and an unwanted glow of excitement, long a stranger to her, persisted as she left the porch and entered the boarded hall. How grey and barn-like this upper part of the house! From the head of the stairway, however, the big living room presented a cheerful contrast. There were warm colors, some comfortable rockers, a lamp that shed a bright light, and an open fire which alone would have dispelled the raw gloom of the day. A large man, in corduroys and top boots, advanced to meet Carly. He had a clean-shaven face that might have been hard and stern but for his smile, and one look into his eyes revealed their resemblance to Flo's. "I'm Tom Hutter, and I'm sure glad to welcome you to Lolamai, Miss Carly," he said. His voice was deep and slow. There were ease and force in his presence, and the grip he gave Carly's hand was that of a man who made no distinction in handshaking. Carly, quick in her perceptions, instantly liked him and sensed in him a strong personality. She greeted him in turn and expressed her thanks for his goodness to Glenn. Naturally, Carly expected him to say something about her fiancé, but he did not. "Well, Miss Carly, if you don't mind, I'll say you're prettier than your picture," said Hutter. "And that is sure saying a lot. All the sheep-herders in the country have taken a peep at your picture. Without permission, you understand."
"I'm greatly flattered," laughed Carly.
"We're glad you've come," replied Hutter simply. "I just got back from the East myself, Chicago and Kansas City. I came to Arizona from Illinois over 30 years ago, and this is my first trip since. Reckon I've never got back my breath yet. Times have changed, Miss Carly, times and people." Mrs. Hutter bustled in from the kitchen, where manifestly she had been importantly engaged.
"Oh, for land's sakes!"
she exclaimed fervently as she threw up her hands at sight of Carly. Her expression was indeed a compliment, but there was a suggestion of shock in it. Then Flo came in. She wore a simple gray gown that reached the top of her high shoes.
"Carly, don't mind Mother," said Flo. "She means your dress is lovely, which is my say, too. But listen, I just saw Glenn coming up the road."
Carly ran to the open door with more haste than dignity. She saw a tall man striding along. Something about him appeared familiar. It was his walk, an erect, swift carriage, with the swing of the march still visible. She recognized Glenn, and all within her seemed to be unstable. She watched him cross the road, face the house. How changed! No, this was not Glenn Kilbourne. This was a bronzed man, wide of shoulder, roughly garbed, heavy-limbed, quite different from the Glenn she remembered. He mounted the porch steps, and Carly, still unseen herself, saw his face. Yes, Glenn. Hot blood seemed to be tingling, liberated in her veins. Wheeling away, she backed against the wall behind the door and held up a warning finger to Flo, who stood nearest. Strange and disturbing, then, to see something in Flo Hutter's eyes that could be read by a woman in only one way. A tall form darkened the doorway. It strode in and halted. Flo, who, where, he began breathlessly. His voice, so well remembered, yet deeper, huskier, fell upon Carly's ears as something unconsciously longed for. His frame had so filled out that she did not recognize it. His face, too, had unbelievably changed, not in the regularity of feature that had been its chief charm, but in contour of cheek and vanishing of pallid hue and tragic line. Carly's heart swelled with joy. Beyond all else she had hoped to see the sad, fixed hopelessness, the havoc gone from his face. Therefore the restraint and nonchalance upon which Carly prided herself sustained eclipse. "Glenn, look who's here," she called, in a voice she could not have steadied to save her life. This meeting was more than she had anticipated. Glenn whirled with an articulate cry. He saw Carly. Then, no matter how unreasonable or exacting had been Carly's longings, they were satisfied. "You!" he cried, and leaped at her with radiant face. Carly not only did not care about the spectators of this meeting, but forgot them utterly. More than the joy of seeing Glenn, more than the all-satisfying assurance to her woman's heart that she was still beloved, welled up a deep, strange, profound something that shook her to her depths. It was beyond selfishness. It was gratitude to God and to the West that had restored him. "Carly, I couldn't believe it was you," he declared, releasing her from his close embrace, yet still holding her. "Yes, Glenn, it's I, all you've left of me," she replied tremulously, and she sought with unsteady hands to put up her dishevelled hair. You big sheep herder, you Goliath." "I never was so knocked off my pins," he said. "A lady to see me, from New York. Of course it had to be you, but I couldn't believe. Carly, you were good to come." Somehow the soft, warm look of his dark eyes hurt her. New and strange indeed it was to her, as were other things about him. Why had she not come west sooner? She disengaged herself from his hold and moved away, striving for the composure habitual with her. Flo Hutter was standing before the fire, looking down. Mrs. Hutter beamed upon Carly. "Now let's have supper," she said. "Reckon Miss Carly can't eat now, after that hug Glenn gave her," drawled Tom Hutter. "I was some worried. You see, Glenn has gained 70 pounds in 6 months, and he doesn't know his own strength." 70 pounds, exclaimed Carly gaily. "I thought it was more." "Oh, Carly, you must excuse my violence," said Glenn. "I've been hugging sheep. That is, when I shear a sheep, I have to hold 'em." They all laughed, and so the moment of readjustment passed. Presently Carly found herself sitting at table directly across from Flo. A pearly whiteness was slowly warming out of the girl's face. Her frank, clear eyes met Carly's, and they had nothing to hide. Carly's first requisite for character in a woman was that she be a thoroughbred. She lacked it often enough herself to admire it greatly in another woman, and that moment saw a birth of respect and sincere liking in her for this Western girl. If Flo Hutter ever was a rival, she would be an honest one. Not long after supper, Tom Hutter winked at Carly and said he Reckoned on general principles, it was his hunch to go to bed. Mrs. Hutter suddenly discovered tasks to perform elsewhere, and Flo said in her cool, sweet drawl, somehow audacious and tantalizing, "Sure you two will want a spoon?" "Now, Flo, Eastern girls are no longer old-fashioned enough for that," declared Glenn. "Too bad. Reckon I can't see how love could ever be old-fashioned. Good night, Glenn. Good night, Carly." Flo stood an instant at the foot of the dark stairway, where the light from the lamp fell upon her face. It seemed sweet and earnest to Carly. It expressed unconscious longing, but no envy. Then she ran up the stairs to disappear. "Glenn, is that girl in love with you?" asked Carly bluntly. To her amaze, Glenn laughed. When had she heard him laugh? It thrilled her, yet nettled her a little. "If that isn't like you," he ejaculated. "Your very first words after we were left alone. Brings back the East, Carly." "Probably recall to memory will be good for you," returned Carly. "But tell me, is she in love with you?" "Why, no, certainly not," replied Glenn. "Anyway, how could I answer such a question? It just made me laugh, that's all." "Humph. I can remember when you were not about making love to a pretty girl. You certainly had me worn to a frazzle before we came engaged," said Carly. "Old times. How long ago they seem. Carly, it's sure wonderful to see you." "How do you like my gown?" asked Carly, pirouetting for his benefit. "Well, what little there is of it is beautiful," he replied with a slow smile. "I always liked you best in white. Did you remember?" "Yes, I got the gown for you, and I'll never wear it except for you." "Same old coquette, same old eternal feminine," he said, half sadly. "You know when you look stunning. But, Carly, the cut of that, or rather the abbreviation of it, inclines me to think that style for women's clothes has not changed for the better. In fact, it's worse than 2 years ago in Paris and later in New York. Where will you women draw the line?" "Women are slaves to the prevailing mode," rejoined Carly. "I don't imagine women who dress would ever draw a line if fashion went on dictating." "But would they care so much if they had to work, plenty of work, and children?" inquired Glenn wistfully. "Well, Anya's feeling all sad for the sheep." They kind of need to be sheared. Well, at least the way they breed them these days. Uh-oh, Rose is getting all heart of fluttery. All right. "Glenn, work and children for modern women? Why, you are dreaming," said Carly with a laugh. She saw him gaze thoughtfully into the glowing embers of the fire, and as she watched him, her quick intuition grasped a subtle change in his mood. It brought a sternness to his face. She could hardly realize that she was looking at Glenn Kilbourne of old. "Come close to the fire," he said, and pulled up a chair for her. Then he threw more wood upon the red coals. "You must be careful not to catch cold out here. The altitude makes a cold dangerous, and that gown is no protection." "Glenn, one chair used to be enough for us," she said archly, standing beside him. But he did not respond to her hint, and a little affronted she accepted the proffered chair. Then he began to ask questions rapidly. He was eager for news from home, from his people, from old friends. However, he did not inquire of Carly and about her friends. She talked unremittingly for an hour before she satisfied his hunger. But when her turn came to ask questions, she found him reticent. He had fallen upon rather hard days at first, out here in the West. Then his health had begun to improve, and as soon as he was able to work, his condition rapidly changed for the better, and now he was getting along pretty well. Carly felt hurt at his apparent disinclination to confide in her. The strong cast of his face, as if it had been chiseled in bronze, the stern set of his lips, and the jaw that protruded, lean and square-cut, the quiet masked light of his eyes, the coarse roughness of his brown hands, mute evidence of strenuous labors. These all gave a different impression from his brief remarks about himself. Lastly, there was a little gray in the light brown hair over his temples. Glenn was only 27, yet he looked 10 years older. Studying him so, with the memory of earlier years in her mind, she was forced to admit that she liked him infinitely more as she was now. Oh no, she was forced to admit that she liked him infinitely more as he was now. He seemed proven. Something had made him a man. Had it been his love for her, or the army service, or the war in France, or the struggle for life and health afterwards? Or had it been this rugged, uncouth West? Carly felt insidious jealousy of this last possibility. She feared this West. She was going to hate it. She had womanly intuition enough to see in Flo Hutter a girl somehow to be reckoned with. Still, Carly would not acknowledge to herself that his simple, unsophisticated Western girl could possibly be a rival. Carly did not need to consider the fact that she had been spoiled by the attention of men. It was not her vanity that precluded Flo Hutter as a rival. Gradually the conversation drew to a lapse, and it suited Carly to let it be so. She watched Glenn as he gazed thoughtfully into the amber depths of the fire. What was going on in his mind? Carly's old perplexity suddenly had rebirth, and with it came an unfamiliar fear which she could not smother. Every moment that she sat there beside Glenn, she was realizing more and more a yearning, passionate love for him, the unmistakable manifestation of his joy at sight of her. The strong, almost rude expression of his love had called to some responsive but hitherto unplumbed deeps of her. If it had not been for these undeniable facts, Carly would have been panic-stricken. They reassured her, yet only made her state of mind more dissatisfied. "Carly, do you still go in for dancing?" Glenn asked presently, with his thoughtful eyes turning to her. "Of course. I like dancing, and it's all about the exercise I get," she replied. "Have the dances changed?" Again. "It's the music. Perhaps that changes the dancing. Jazz is becoming popular, and about all the crowd dances now is an infinite variation of foxtrot." "No waltzing?" "I don't believe I waltzed once this winter." "Jazz? That's a sort of tin-panning, jiggly stuff, isn't it?" "Glenn, it's the fever of the public pulse," replied Carly. "The graceful waltz, like the stately minuet, flourished back in the days when people rested rather than raced." "More's the pity," said Glenn. Then, after a moment, in which his gaze returned to the fire, he inquired rather too casually, "Does Morrison still chase after you?" "Glenn, I'm neither old nor married." She laughed. "Glenn, I'm neither old nor married," she replied, laughing. "No, that's true. But if you were married, it wouldn't make any difference to Morrison." Carly could not detect bitterness or jealousy in his voice. She would not have been averse to hearing either. She gathered from his remark, however, that he was going to be harder than ever to understand. What had she said or done to make him retreat within himself, aloof, impersonal, unfamiliar? He did not impress her as lover-like. What irony of fate was this that held her there, yearning for his kisses and caresses as never before, while he watched the fire and talked as to a mere acquaintance, and seemed sad and far away. Or did she merely imagine that? Only one thing could she be sure of at that moment, and it was that pride would never be her ally. I'm just going to catch up with chat here real fast. Yeah, So Rose is she's talking about him and the gown. Yeah, he seems to have I don't know. It seems to have become a little more maybe socially conservative there since moving out west. The Oregon woods up there. Yes, something it says message retracted by Scorpion Knight. So I don't know if that was a chat filter here or if Scorpion Knight deleted it himself. I don't know enough about the YouTube chat functions yet. Put her to work on a farm. She would hate the sheep. Oh boy, man! Where I grew up, sheeps were everywhere. Couldn't get away from the sheep. Oh, and Rose doesn't like jazz either. What? Uh-oh. Okay. Glenn, look here, she said, sliding her chair close to his and holding out her left hand, slim and white with its glittering diamond on the third finger. He took her hand in his and pressed it and smiled at her. Yes, Carly, it's a beautiful, soft little hand, but I think I like it better if it were strong and brown and coarse on the inside, from useful work. Like Flo Hutter's? Queried Carly. Yes. Carly looked proudly into his eyes. People are born in different stations. I respect your little western friend, Glenn, but could I wash and sweep, milk cows and chop wood, and all that sort of thing? Well, I suppose you couldn't, he admitted, with a blunt little laugh. Would you want me to? She asked. Well, that's hard to say, he replied, knitting his brows. I hardly know. I think it depends on you. But if you did do such work, wouldn't you be happier? Happier? Why, Glenn, I'd be miserable. But listen, it wasn't my beautiful and useless hand I wanted you to see. It was my engagement ring. Oh. Well, he went on slowly. I've never had it off since you left New York, she said softly. You gave it to me 4 years ago. Do you remember? It was on my 22nd birthday. You said it would take 2 months' salary to pay the bill. It sure did, he retorted with a hint of humor. Glenn, during the war it was not so very hard to wear this ring as an engagement ring should be worn, said Carly, growing more earnest. But after the war, especially after your departure west, it was terribly hard to be true to the significance of this betrothal ring. There was a letdown in all women. Oh, no one need tell me. There was, and men were affected by that, and the chaotic condition of the times. New York was wild during the year of your absence. Prohibition was a joke. Well, I gadded, danced, dressed, drank, smoked, motored, just the same as the other women in our crowd. Something drove me to. I never rested. Excitement seemed to be happiness. Glenn, I'm not making any plea to excuse all that, but I want you to know how under trying circumstances I was absolutely true to you. Understand me, I mean true as regards love. Through it all I loved you just the same, and now I'm with you much more. Your last letter hurt me. I don't know just how, but I came west to see you, to tell you this, and to ask you, do you want this ring back? Certainly not, he replied forcibly, with a dark flush spreading over his face. Then you love me, she whispered. Yes, I love you, he returned deliberately. and in spite of all you say, very probably more than you love me. But you, like all women, make love and its expression the sole object of life. Carly, I've been concerned with keeping my body from the grave and my soul from hell."
"But, dear, you're well now," she returned with trembling lips.
"Yes, I've almost pulled out."
"Then what is wrong?"
"Wrong? With me or you?" he queried, with a keen, enigmatical glance upon her.
"What is wrong between us? There is something."
"Carly, a man who's been on the verge, as I have been, seldom or never comes back to happiness. But perhaps—"
"You frighten me,"
cried Carly, and rising she sat up upon the arm of his chair and encircled his neck with her arms.
"How can I help if I do not understand? Am I so miserably little? Glenn, must I tell you? No woman can live without love. I need to be loved. That's all that's wrong with me."
"Carly, you are still an imperious, mushy girl," replied Glenn, taking her into his arms. "I need to be loved too, but that's not what is wrong with me. You'll have to find it out yourself."
"You're a dear old sphinx," she retorted.
"Listen, Carly," he said earnestly, "about this love-making stuff, please don't misunderstand me. I love you. I'm starved for your kisses. But is it right to ask them?"
"Right? Aren't we engaged? And don't I want to give them?"
"If I were only sure we'd be married," he said in low, tense voice, as if speaking more to himself.
"Married?" cried Carly, convulsively clasping him. "Of course we'll be married. Glenn, you wouldn't jilt me."
"Carly, what I mean is that you might never really marry me," he answered seriously.
"Oh, if that's all you need to be sure of, Glenn Kilbourne, you may begin to make love to me right now."
It was late when Carly went up to her room, and she was in such a softened mood, so happy and excited and yet disturbed in mind, that the coldness and the darkness did not matter in the least. She undressed in pitchy blackness, stumbling over chair and bed, feeling for what she needed, and in her mood this unusual proceeding was fun. When ready for bed, she opened the door to take a peep out. Through the dense blackness the waterfall showed dimly opaque. Carly felt a soft mist wet her face. The low roar of the falling water seemed to envelop her. Under the cliff wall brooded impenetrable gloom. But out above the treetops shone great stars, wonderfully white and radiant and cold, with a piercing contrast to the deep, clear blue of sky. The waterfall hummed into an absolutely dead silence. It emphasized the silence. Not only cold was it that made Carly shudder. How lonely, how lost, how hidden this canyon. Then she hurried to bed, grateful for the warm, woolly blankets. Relaxation and thought brought consciousness of the heat of her blood, the beat and throb and swell of her heart, of the tumult within her. In the lonely darkness of her room she might have faced the truth of her strangely renewed and augmented love for Glenn Kilbourne. But she was more concerned with her happiness. She had won him back. Her presence, her love, had overcome his restraint. She thrilled in the sweet consciousness of her woman's conquest. How splendid he was! To hold back physical tenderness, the simple expressions of love, because he had feared they might unduly influence her. He had grown in many ways. She must be careful to reach up to his ideals. That about Flo Hutter's toil-hardened hands, Was that significance somehow connected with the rift in the lute? For Carly admitted to herself that there was something amiss, something incomprehensible, something intangible that obtruded its menace into her dream of future happiness. Still, what had she to fear, so long as she could be with Glenn? And yet there were forced upon her, insistent and perplexing, the questions. Was her love selfish? Was she considering him? Was she blind to something he could see? Tomorrow and next day, and the days to come, held promise of joyous companionship with Glenn, yet likewise they seemed full of a portent of trouble for her, or fight and ordeal, of lessons that would make life significant for her. Man. Interesting. Oh, yeah, so yeah, okay. Not quite. I guess it is a little more on the Harlequin romance side of things than I thought. Okay, see, it seems to be more Carly's story than Glenn Kilbourne's story. I don't know. We'll see how it turns out. That's as far as we're going with this, though. These chapters seem to be fairly long, almost 10% of the book apiece. We'll continue with it tomorrow. Man. We can end with a little short story, though. We still got 10 minutes. We got 10 minutes. We can do something with that. Oh yeah, that's right. We did the Secret of the Gods yesterday. That was actually really funny, I thought. The prophet, he actually did. We went out and found the secret of the gods, and then the snake got him. So here we go. We're just going to end with a little Lord Dunsany here, The South Wind, from his collection Time and the Gods. Let's do it. Two players sat down to play a game together, to while eternity away, and they chose the gods as pieces wherewith to play their game. And for their board of playing they chose the sky, from rim to rim, whereon lay a little dust, and every speck of dust was a world upon the board of playing. And the players were robed, and their faces veiled, and the robes and veils were alike, and their names were Fate and Chance. And as they played their game, and moved the gods hither and thither about the board, the dust rose and shone in the light from the players' eyes that gleamed behind the veils. Then said the gods, "See how we stir the dust." It chanced, or was ordained, who knoweth which, that Ord, a prophet, one night saw the gods as they strode knee-deep among the stars. But as he gave them worship, he saw the hand of a player, enormous over their heads, stretched out to make his move. Then Ord, the prophet, knew. Had he been silent, it might have still been well with Ord. But Ord went about the world, crying out to all men, "There is a power over the gods." This the gods heard. Then said they, "Ord hath seen." Terrible is the vengeance of the gods, and fierce were their eyes when they looked on the head of Ord, and snatched out of his mind all knowledge of themselves. And that man's soul went wandering afield, to find for itself gods, for ever finding them not. Then out of Ord's dream of life the gods plucked the moon and the stars, and in the night time he only saw black sky, and saw the lights no more. Next the gods took from him, for their vengeance resteth not, the birds and butterflies, flowers and leaves and insects, and all small things. And the prophet looked on the world that was strangely altered, yet knew not of the anger of the gods. Then the gods sent away his familiar hills, to be seen no more by him, and all the pleasant woodlands on their summits, and the further fields. And in a narrower world Ord walked round and round, now seeing little, and his soul still wandered, searching for some gods, and finding none. Lastly, the gods took away the fields and stream, and left to the prophet only his house and the larger things that were in it. Day by day they crept about him, drawing films of mist between him and familiar things, till at last he beheld naught at all, and was quite blind and unaware of the anger of the gods. Is that there, Kirby Reeves? Then Ord's world became only a world of sound, and only by hearing he kept his hold upon things. All the profit that he had out of his days was here, some song from the hills, or there the voice of the birds, and sound of the stream, or the drip of the falling rain. But the anger of the gods ceases not with the closing of flowers, nor is it assuaged by all the winter's snows, nor doth it rest in the full glare of summer. And they snatched away from Ord one night his world of sound, and he awoke deaf. But as a man may smite away the hive of the bee, and the bee with all his fellows builds again, knowing not what hath smitten his hive, or that it shall smite again, so Ord built for himself a world out of old memories, and set it in the past. There he builded himself cities out of former joys, and therein built palaces of mighty things achieved, and with his memory as a key he opened golden locks, and had still a world to live in, though the gods had taken from him the world of sound and all the world of sight. But the gods tire not from pursuing, and they seized his world of former things, and took his memory away, and covered up the paths that led to the past, and left him blind and deaf and forgetful among men, and caused all men to know that this was he who had once said that the gods were little things. So the GKS was going on. And lastly, the gods took his soul, and out of it they fashioned the south wind to roam the seas forever, and not have rest. And well the south wind knows that he hath once understood, somewhere and long ago. And so he moans to the islands, and cries along southern shores, I have known, and I have known. But all things sleep when the south wind speaks to them, and none heed his cry that he hath known, but are rather content to sleep. But still the south wind, knowing that there is something that he hath forgot, goes on crying, I have known, seeking to urge men to arise and to discover it. But none heed the sorrows of the south wind, even when he driveth his tears out of the south. So that though the south wind cries on, and never findeth rest, none heed that there is aught that may be known, and the secret of the gods is safe. But the business of the south wind is with the north, and it is said that the time will one day come when he shall overcome the bergs and sink the seas of ice, and come where the secret of the gods is graven upon the pole. And the game of fate and chance shall suddenly cease, and he that loses shall cease to be, or ever to have been. And from the board of playing fate or chance, who knoweth which shall win, shall sweep the gods away. And that brings us to the end of today's book club. Yeah. Nice to see some people popping in. Unfortunately, we're just winding up the day right now. You're making bread. That sounds great, GK. That's Dr. Games, Dr. B Games. I am looking very shaggy today. No. Very good. Yeah, haven't had a haircut since, February. Man. Unbelievable. But there we go. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, you're very welcome there, Melissa. Let me catch up on chat. World of 28 millimeters here as well. Oh, yes. World of 28 millimeters. Oh, you know what? Okay, that's referring to like little figurine. That's the scale of the figurines. You know, I was thinking it was a reference to camera lens. That's the first thing that popped into my mind. Yeah, we'd start talking about like numbers and millimeters. It's like, okay, that's a certain size lens. All right, man. Okay. That is it. Anyway, boy, oh boy, yeah. Unfortunately, I'm ending right as a few people have been popping on in. We'll be back tomorrow. 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. We'll be continuing with The Call of the Canyon by Zane Grey. Okay, it's boys. It's really not turning out how I thought it was going to turn out. Only 2 chapters in. Okay. But yeah, it's all Carly's story.